In 1492, Columbus began exploring the Atlantic Ocean with the support of Queen Isabel. After 10 weeks, his fleet reached the Bahamas. Christopher Columbus thought he had reached Asia when he landed in the Bahamas. He called the people he met there Indians because he thought they were from India. He also took some of the natives back to Spain with him as proof of his discovery.
It wasn't until Columbus's third voyage in 1498 that he landed on the mainland of the Americas. This new continent began to be called America after Amerigo Vespucci, who promoted the new continent, not Columbus.
Native peoples of the Americas first settled there between about 14,000 and 16,000 years ago, and it is estimated that they came from the Eurasian continent. What is clear is that it was not the Europeans who first discovered the Americas, but the Native Americans.
Anyway, after the arrival in the Americas by Columbus in the 15th century, European powers such as Spain and Portugal began to come over to Florida and Central and South America in large numbers to excavate gold mines and spread their religion. Since then, not only Spain and Portugal, which occupied colonies in the Americas, but also latecomers, such as the Netherlands, England, and France began flocking to the American continent, and a full-fledged scramble for colonization took place. In 1607, England established a colony called Jamestown in what is now Virginia, and in 1608, French established Quebec. In 1624, the Dutch settled in Manhattan. Meanwhile, in England, Puritans were continuously persecuted and treated as followers of cults. These Puritans moved to the Netherlands, where freedom of religion was guaranteed from around the 1600s, but there they were treated as foreign workers and limited to low-wage labor. In the end, some Puritans who could not stand this situation decided to move to the new continent and created a society where they could freely practice and spread Puritanism. In September 1620, 35 believers who called themselves Pilgrims and 67 ordinary settlers moved from Plymouth, England to the Massachusetts area on the Mayflower. Unlike the existing colonization migrants, they were able to quickly build a stable life while maintaining good relations with the natives. They had a big party in the fall when they had their first harvest after settling down. At this time, the native warriors who helped the settlers at the time were invited guests. The settlers and natives celebrated their first Thanksgiving with a 3-day party of turkey, pumpkin, and corn. 13 years later, most of the natives in the area had died from a smallpox epidemic carried by Europeans. After 10 years of emigration, the Puritans paid up their debts in London with the wealth they had accumulated during that time and even set up a colonial company to create a refuge for the Puritans in the New World. Afterwards, British colonization proceeded at a rapid pace due to persecuted Puritans and migrants who wanted to make a fortune. In addition to Britain, France and Spain also expanded their territory by fighting wars against each other's colonies and the natives. During this process, the Dutch eventually withdrew from the North American continent due to war with Britain and handed over New York to the British. The Dutch built and developed colonies on the North American continent after founding New York in 1609.
However, the Dutch lost the war with England and ceded New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Connecticut to England in 1664. In the middle of the 17th century, the Glorious Revolution began in England, marking the beginning of constitutional monarchy.
In fact, Britain, unlike other powers, had almost neglected its colonies in North America. Due to the Glorious Revolution that broke out on the mainland, England was unable to pay attention to what was happening in the distant colonies. During this time, the colonists began to establish their own political systems in each region, free from British interference.
So, about 100 years later, in the 1750s, the colonies were already living in a world that was very different from Britain. Nevertheless, in the hearts of the colonists, the pride that they were citizens of the British Empire remained and never faded.
In 1754, war broke out between Britain and France, which had been in continuous conflict over colonial sovereignty issues on the North American continent. This war escalated into the 7 Years' War in Europe and developed into a very fierce conflict, and the famous Lieutenant Colonel George Washington participated in the war at this time. The war eventually ended with a great British victory, and Britain was able to secure vast territories, 4 times the size of its former colonies. However, Britain also suffered huge debt by pouring an astronomical sum of £65 million in the war with France. Britain began to think about various ways to cover its finances and imposed heavy additional taxes on the colonies that had been compliant with the taxes. Britain made the colonists angry by imposing tariffs on imports of daily necessities such as sugar, coffee and wine, and taxes on newspapers, calendars, and driver's licenses. They argued that they should not pay taxes because there was no representative of the colonies in the British Parliament. No taxation without representation, the colonists continued their resistance. Embarrassed by this unexpected resistance, the British authorities abolished all the taxes they had imposed so far, except for the one on black tea. However, the British authorities unfairly enforced black tea tariffs only on colonial merchants and exempted their own East India companies from tariffs. The angry colonists who learned this fact continued to resist more radically than before. On December 16, 1773, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded the British merchant ship Dartmouth, which was moored in Boston Harbor. They broke open 342 chests of tea and dumped the contents into the sea. This was the famous Boston Tea Party, and the British government was so outraged that it immediately closed the Boston port and issued all sorts of retaliatory bills against the colonies. The colonists were outraged by the coercive acts, and they began to calling them the intolerable acts. The 13 colonial states, each living in a different way, gradually began to unite as one through this incident. The colonies had different cultures and histories, but they all shared a common goal: independence from Britain. Eventually, in September 1774, the colonial states held the First Continental Congress to prepare for the possible battle with Britain, and meanwhile, the British government also decided to subdue the rebellious colonists. Then, on April 19, 1775, the first battle between the colonists and the British Army broke out in Massachusetts, which had organized the greatest retaliation against the British government, and this event became the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. The 13 colonial states judged that they had passed the point of no return and convened the Second Continental Congress to confirm the agreement of all colonial representatives to support the war.
At this conference, the 13 states formed the Continental Union Army, a unified military force made up of soldiers from all 13 colonies, with George Washington, who was a Virginia planter and military officer, as commander-in-chief. On July 4, 1776, the colonial states announced the Declaration of Independence from Britain.
The colonial union would be relieved of all obligations to the King of England, and all political relations with the British Empire would be completely dissolved, and so be it. As a result, the 13 colonial states declared the United States of the Americas. The British Army, which had an overwhelming advantage over the Continental Army, did not think they were actually fighting a war.
The British Army only had the intention to discipline the poor judgment of the colonists. However, in early 1776, when British troops became isolated in Boston and suffered heavy casualties, they gradually began to realize the seriousness of the situation.
After the defeat at Boston, the British set out for New York with 130 warships and 30,000 regular troops. The Continental Army, which numbered only 19,000 men, had no choice but to retreat helplessly in front of the British Army's overwhelming firepower, and the British Army, confident of victory, began to leisurely expand into the area. However, the British began to lose again and again to the fierce guerrilla tactics by the United States, along with the continuous mistakes of their commanders, and the Continental Army won both battles in the Battle of Saratoga, a turning point in the American Revolution. At the same time, the war situation changed, and France, hearing of the victories of the United States, officially entered the war as its ally in February 1778 to avenge the shame of the preceding 7 years' war, in which it had been defeated by Britain. In addition, Spain and the Netherlands, which had been providing material supporting along with France, officially declared their participation in the war in aid of the United States. So the war between Britain and the United States escalated into an international war between Britain and the United States, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. In fact, France, Spain, and the Netherlands were all countries that had suffered humiliating defeats to England in the past, so there must have been a spirit of revenge. As the other countries entered the war, Britain's absolute supremacy was challenged, and the tide of battle slowly began to turn toward the United States. France and Spain blockaded the British Navy through naval battles, and Spain, which had colonies in North America, fought with the United States on both sides. Since then, the United States and Britain continued their war, winning and losing against each other several times. In 1781, continuing to suffer from guerrilla campaigns by the Continental Army, British troops invaded Yorktown, plundering supplies and attempting to set up a defensive posture. Then the Continental and French troops entered Yorktown by surprise. In this battle, the British Army tried to resist for months and eventually declared a surrender, surrendering over 7,000 soldiers who became prisoners of war. Since then, the de facto war ended, and voices of protest to stop the war continued to rise from within the UK. On September 3, 1783, through the Treaty of Paris, the United States was recognized as a fully independent country and took over all of its colonies. Spain also gained Florida as a result of this war. After the war, Spain was awarded Florida in the 1783 Treaty of Paris. Spain ruled Florida until 1821, when it sold the territory to the United States. And the United States, which existed only as a confederation of 13 individual states, was later united into the United States of America through the Congress of Philadelphia in 1787. So it took the form of the federal state it is today, and began to take a full-fledged step into the harsh international politics of the era. For reference, France achieved revenge against England in this war, but its national treasury was empty due to excessive military spending, so it was swept away liberal revolution of angry people. The American Revolution had a financial impact on France. The French people were indeed shocked to see the United States being built without a king.
For centuries, France had been a monarchy, and the king was seen as the embodiment of the state. The idea of a country without a king was simply unthinkable to most French people. However, the success of the American Revolution showed that it was possible to build a successful country without a king.
This development inspired the French revolutionaries, and they began to question the need for a monarchy in France. The French Revolution was a long and bloody process, but it eventually led to the establishment of a republic in France. The French people were finally free from the rule of the king, and they were able to build a new country based on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity.
The American Revolution had a profound impact on France and showed the French people that it was possible to overthrow a monarchy and establish a republic. The French Revolution was a direct result of the American Revolution, and it helped to spread the ideals of liberty and democracy around the world. Thank you for watching the video, The American Revolution, provided by History and Current Events. Gina, Bella, Cindy, and Tony have contributed so far as narrators. Thank you.